Today's talk is entitled titled Table Fellowship with Jesus and His Followers. Listen to me, all of you, and understand. And if anyone has ears to hear, then let him hear this. These are words not mine, but Jesus spoke after he called the multitude to draw near to him at Mark 7 verse 14. So he wanted everyone within earshot to come in close for something important that he had to say. He did this in response to scribes and Pharisees who had just earlier found fault with his disciples for what they regarded was a serious violation of one of the many rules and regulations which Jewish tradition prescribed for food and fellowship. In this case, the disciples were seen eating bread together without first washing their hands. At issue was firstly food and consequently fellowship. Firstly, food eaten with unwashed hands was believed to be unclean or non-kosher, which then also made the eater unclean, rendering him defiled, unholy, and of course unacceptable to God. Secondly, anyone judged to be defiled was also regarded as a defiling influence on others who subsequently came in contact with him, which meant he must therefore be excluded from any association with those who were clean. In other words, he had no fellowship with them. To this diverse group of leaders, disciples, and multitudes, Jesus declared as plainly as possible what is one of the most basic truths any seeker of God's kingdom and his righteousness should hope to grasp, which is this. Jesus said, "There is nothing outside of a man which can defile him by going into him. But what defiles a man are all the things which proceed out of man." The complaint from the scribes and Pharisees was not merely about kosher table fellowship, and neither was what Jesus said about what goes into a man altogether about food. In fact, for Jesus' audience who held the traditions of the venerated Jewish elders, Pharisees especially, who put most emphasis on purity and purification, kosher laws of clean and unclean related to almost every aspect of their lives. As most saw it, they were at risk of defilement from all sorts of external uncleanness. And while a staunch, pious Jew would never willingly associate with uncleanness, he might come in contact with it unintentionally or unknowingly, and would thus be considered defiled and separate from God in spite of all his piety and virtue. He imagined being assailed on every side by defiling influences, and thus had to be fastidious about keeping separate from them. He was careful not to touch or enter an unfamiliar dwelling. He daily changed and washed his clothes. He bathed only in running water. He cleansed his furniture and utensils. He whitewashed grave sites so they were easily seen and avoided. And he filtered his drinks so that there were no specks of something that might be defiling. He ceased charitable work on Sabbath days, according to Luke 13 verse 14. He tithed everything, according to Luke 18 verse 12. He kept his distance from the dying and used only kosher coins in the temple, according to John 2 verse 14 and Matthew 21 verse 12. He did not enter the Roman Praetorium, according to John 18 verse 28. And he also wore phylacteries as an amulet or charm to ward off evil. This was a later development. Evidently the Jews may have worn phylacteries 1,000 years before Jesus' day, but they weren't treating them as amulets or charms to ward off evil in the same way that the Pharisees did. Avoiding or shielding himself against everything that could defile him might mean having to keep other people at a safe distance. Any person deemed unclean posed a threat, and a pious Jew would need to exclude, distance, and segregate them from himself, which is why he was so averse to and so offended by table fellowship with people judged to be sinners. So for the scribes and Pharisees and Jesus' audience at Mark 7 verse 14, it was the risk to themselves of being defiled by contact with Jesus' unclean disciples that they were truly indignant about, a risk which extended to their entire Jewish society and nation. Here then were two accusations in one. Firstly, defilement by commission of a sin. Secondly, defilement by association with those that were defiled. In calling out the disciples' dirty hands and their consequent uncleanness, these scribes and Pharisees implied that Jesus was spiritually defiled too, either from his own contact with the disciples or from his indulgence of their behaviour, or on the presumption that they were following his example, because of course disciples must take after their leader. And thus it was necessary for Jesus at Mark 7 verse 15 to deliver this forceful reply. There is nothing outside of a man which by going into him can defile him, but what truly defiles a man is everything that proceeds out of the man. Here he stated that what makes a man defiled before God, the source of his defilement, is himself. Each man is the sole cause of his own defiled state and cannot attribute it to anything or anyone else but himself. Nothing else, no matter how unclean, and nobody else, however sinful, is the root cause or bears the blame for a man's own defilement and separation from God. And this is because, as Jesus went on to say at verses 21 through 23, all the evils which defile men proceed from out of the heart of men. And that's a long list. I won't go through the list, but you take the point that what Jesus is saying is that what causes us to be unclean in God's sight is going on up here in our mind and heart. It's nothing from outside of us. This principle touches on every aspect of the lives of every human being, whether a seeker of God's righteousness or not. It is why we are all sinners and defiled before God, however much we focus on avoiding external evils and temptations. It is also, crucially, the very reason Jesus could so readily and gladly share table fellowship with all comers, however sinful, even while his fellow Jews could not. Due to their belief that sin assails them from outside, they were constantly hung up on the false notion that other people could somehow defile them. But Jesus never was. He never had such a hang-up. We noted in the previous talk that the Lord Jesus Christ's gracious and merciful character manifested early on in his public ministry, particularly in his practice of sharing food or a meal, a practice commonly known as table fellowship or commensality. We noted that it was this practice that first provoked Judaistic Jews to express criticism of Jesus. As with most peoples around the world, Jews in Jesus' day held that an offer of or an invitation to and reception at a shared meal is a most sublime act of fellowship that expresses a spirit of mutual goodwill between any two individuals or communities. On the other side of the coin, the Jews also held that their non-acceptance of any individual or community always entailed shunning and debarring them, not merely from fellowship in general, but from shared food especially. Jewish tradition had built up such a detailed array of strict prohibitions around kosher food, meal preparation, dining etiquette, and acceptable dinner companions that for most Jews, meals were more an exercise in excluding or denying fellowship to individuals or communities than of offering it to them. That is, than of offering fellowship to them. Jesus' type of commensality was utterly radical in that it was receptive and inclusive of the very individuals or communities that Jews traditionally shunned and debarred. This was not only challenging and provocative to the Jewish leaders, but also to the common Jews born and raised into the same tradition. For those who wished to follow Jesus, or who had already chosen to do so, It did not come instinctively or readily to them to welcome and accept the very wide range of humanity which they were to come to learn that Jesus himself would accept. This resistance would only change as they grew in the grace and mercy they learned by following him and continuing under his instruction. As we saw last time, very early in his ministry, Jesus began to challenge and extend the spiritual concepts of fellowship which were held by many of the followers who would become his closest disciples and even his apostles. He did this early on when he made contact with the Samaritan woman at the well, for as you appreciate, Jews at that stage had no dealings with Samaritans, and Jesus not only asked from her a drink of water, but eventually stayed with that Samaritan community for a few days with his disciples. He also extended his disciples by welcoming into his inner circle a man who was regarded by most Jews as a national traitor, a turncoat and a stooge of the Roman occupiers, and this was the tax collector Matthew Levi. And at the convivial banquet which Matthew Levi held in his own home, Jesus then showed that he was able to share table fellowship not only with his disciples, but also with those who were not counted among his disciples. We considered the criticism that provoked from the religious leaders, but it was also a challenge to his closer disciples as well. Well, it was a year later that Jesus sent 12 disciples to minister without him for the very first time. This was when he first commissioned these 12 men to be his apostles or sent ones. They had to represent their Lord by speaking and ministering in his name, on his behalf, with authority and power he had vested in them. To see and hear them, the 12, would be, in theory at least, the equivalent of seeing and hearing the Lord Jesus Christ in person. Regarding table fellowship, Jesus commanded these apostles at Luke chapter 9 verse 3 to carry no food with them. They were to go out into the Galilean world but not have anything for sustenance. Similarly, at Luke 10, Jesus later instructed 70 other disciples to accept hospitality from any house or city that welcomes them and to eat or drink whatever they offer. So it seems that it was not until that time, with just a year of public ministry yet to run, that Jesus finally trusted his closest disciples, his sent ones, to willingly dine with any Jews who might welcome them as followers of Christ. That is, Jesus now expected these disciples to have table fellowship with all Jews of whatever ilk or reputation or whatever their social status or their social standing may have been. The mission of the 12 apostles seems to have been a success and a joyful experience for them, but after such a successful mission and the positive experience of being able to freely receive a meal in Jesus' name wherever they went, could the 12 then learn to also freely give in the same way that they had received? Well, apparently not even after 2.5 years of Jesus' ministry. The apostles failed repeatedly when faced with over 5,000 people near Lake Galilee. Jesus' compassion and welcome for this crowd, which is well expressed in the Gospels, the care and service that he gave them, especially emphasized in stark contrast to the apostles' response. When Jesus first checked on the apostles' faith in God's ability to provide food in that remote place, Philip's immediate concern at John chapter 6 verse 7 was monetary cost, a complaint echoed later in the day by all 12 who wanted to send the people away and make them fend for themselves. So Jesus then had to prod and stretch the apostles' tractability to the limit with direct commands. At Matthew 14 verse 16, it records that he said, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And Mark 6 verse 37 records that he says to them, "How many loaves do you have?" Obviously, there was a bit of a pause and nobody said anything. And he said, "Go and look." It was a command. But to the apostles, it was all inexplicable. Here were at least 5,000 people, 5,000 men plus women and children. Even though the disciples had seen Jesus turn water into wine, they'd seen him cure leprosy, they'd seen him halt a storm, they'd seen him raise the dead by now, and yet they still failed to perceive or conceive of his power. At Luke chapter 9 verse 13, after a boy presented them with 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes, Jesus said concerning these food items, but he also said it just as truly concerning the people themselves, "Bring them here to me." The 12 apostles were still at a loss as Jesus ordered them to help him and to sort the crowd into groups so as to share out the food. His instructions must have been as flabbergasting as the supernatural event that they were all about to witness. And I trust that everyone here is familiar with the story of the feeding of the 5,000, how that Jesus was continually breaking the loaves and the fishes and continually distributed them first to the apostles and then the apostles to the various groups of people. As we know from all 4 Gospels, this amazing miracle took place and was unprecedented in Israel's history since the giving of the manna had ceased in Joshua's day some 14 centuries earlier. After Jesus took possession of the bread, it was broken and shared out to all. Mark 6 verse 41 describes the fishes also being parted and apportioned to everyone in just the same way as the bread had been. Very interestingly, Mark 6 verse 39 calls the clusters of people, the groups of people, as they'd been set up into their groups of some 50 people or so, but Mark calls these symposiums, a Greek word which means drinking groups and referred originally in classical Greek to joyful social gatherings with food, wine, discussion, oratory, that is speaking, music, singing and dancing. Now this picture is a lot to hang on one word, and I won't elaborate on the point, but symposium was a specialist term well known throughout the Greco-Roman world. Mark could not have used it without this specific meaning and usage familiar to his Greek-speaking readership. And who should say that the feeding of the 5,000 did not incorporate exactly what Mark implied by that word symposium? So not only was there bread and fishes, but there could have been wine, discussion, oratory, music, singing and dancing. No wonder the people wanted to make Jesus king. Well, Jesus required the multitude to sit in groups of 50 or 100 people. One important effect of this arrangement was that each person, no matter in what group he or she found themselves, was sure to end up sitting near many people who were not their close family or friends, some of whom would include a total stranger, or maybe a disagreeable neighbour, or an irritating work colleague, or a long-standing enemy, or a person with a disreputable history. Each person would be required to give and receive among people whose background, beliefs, and moral standing in their community was unknown to them. It was a simple lesson of not being discriminatory when having food and fellowship in Jesus' presence. More than 2 years ago, Jesus had secretly turned water to wine, and since then, Jesus had made food and drink integral to his ministry and taught his disciples to be agreeable dinner guests. But by his feeding of the 5,000, Jesus had, for the first time, I think, served as host of a meal. He was actually initiating the meal. Obviously, the apostles weren't going to. They just wanted the people to scatter, and they wanted to be done with them. So Jesus initiated the meal, taking on the role of a host. And by this, he began to show the 12 their own next essential ministry, not preaching or miracles, but sacrificial giving. From early on, Jesus had shown his disciples his readiness to fraternize with and to minister to people whom most Jews considered to be out of bounds, be they leprous or lunatics, whether they were born crippled or blind, whether they were issuing blood for any reason, and of course even if they were dead. At John 4, he ministered to Samaritans. At Luke 7, he ministered to a Roman centurion. At Matthew 15, he ministered to a Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman. Again, another example of the sort of person that the disciples just wanted to be rid of. They asked Jesus to make her leave, but he wouldn't. Amid the 5,000 at Galilee, Jesus showed he could share food with any and all comers. The apostles had wanted to send them away, folk whom they regarded as just needy, inconvenient strangers. But at least the 5,000 were Galileans. They were at least their fellow countrymen, and so they were, to that extent somewhat acceptable to the apostles, who were also Galileans. But the test of discipleship got tougher for the 12 a few months later when an opportunity came to feed over 4,000 Gentiles. This horde of maimed and injured men, women and children had followed Jesus, seeing his amazing power, given glory to Israel's God, but now, after 3 days of travelling, they were becoming famished. Christ's compassion for them was expressed at Matthew 15 verse 32 and at Mark 8 verse 2, and it should have moved the hard hearts and the stiff necks of the 12, but they never suggested that Jesus' food miracle for the 5,000 be repeated for these Gentiles, because of course the disciples were Jewish and they wanted no dealings with Gentiles. The disciples even feigned ignorance of Jesus' ability, and they refused to disclose, let alone offer, their own provisions. In the end, Jesus had to tell them to. This time, faithlessness was not the stumbling block for the apostles, it was lack of love. Yet for all that they were so bigoted and selfish toward these outsiders, their teacher and master remained very gracious, not only to the 4,000, but to his apostles. The 12 never lost out by his generosity. They also ate at these miracle feedings. They also were filled, and they even came away with baskets full of leftovers. Well, not long after Jesus miraculously fed the 4,000 Gentiles, he returned to Western Galilee, where he was approached by a consortium of Pharisees and Sadducees who wanted to see a sign from him. Presumably they'd heard about the feeding of the 5,000. Now they wanted to see something miraculous. After Jesus labelled them a wicked and adulterous generation, he left them and departed back across the lake. Obviously, he was in no mood to indulge the Pharisees and Sadducees. Reading onward from Matthew 16 verse 5 and Mark 8 verse 14, we hear Jesus tell the apostles to take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod. Mark 8 verse 15 says he was ordering his apostles to take heed, and the Greek indicates that the order was given strongly, emphatically and repeatedly. Obviously it was important. 3 Jewish parties, the Pharisees, the Sadducees and the Herodians, were now allied in opposition to Jesus, and it was imperative that his disciples be aware of all 3 groups. The apostles reasoned with one another about his leaven reference, so it seems they all initially agreed its meaning was not absolutely clear. They knew, of course, that leaven referred to the chemical that causes bread to rise. We might use leaven today in the form of yeast. They used it in the form of old dough. Anyway, on this occasion, the disciples, the apostles, had forgotten to bring bread with them and only had 1 loaf in the boat. So they apparently concluded that Jesus must be expecting them to go and buy more bread, and he was ordering them not to purchase it from anyone identified with the Jewish groups he had just now criticized and turned away from. Having heard Jesus call his enemies wicked and adulterous, and then crossed the lake with him to get far away from those enemies, the disciples must have reflexively thought he was only doing what all pious Jews do when they sensed unholiness in others, which is end all contact with them and with anyone or anything associated with them. I imagine it was an easy, instinctive conclusion for Christ's disciples to agree on, because they had been raised from childhood to believe that spiritual purity demanded they have no contact with others judged to be impure. Being born into the influence of that belief and custom, it was ingrained in them by the time of Jesus' ministry, and it was instinctive for them to think along those lines. Peter's experiences years later with Cornelius and the Jerusalem church at Acts chapter 10 and 11, and then Peter's decision to stop having table fellowship with his Gentile brethren at Galatians chapter 2, remind us how strong the Judaistic mindset remained even in one of the pillars of the church many years after Jesus' resurrection. Yet if this was the apostles' eventual conclusion, their need to reason with one another shows that none of them had immediately settled for it. In other words, they were still questioning what Jesus meant when he was talking about beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, etc. So they hadn't immediately settled for their initial conclusion, and it would seem that each man felt that there was something incongruous or paradoxical about it. Yes, Jesus had snubbed the Pharisees and Sadducees just now, but the apostles also knew Jesus was usually very tolerant toward them. He had no qualms about associating or eating with sinners, even Pharisees, such as Simon at Luke chapter 7 verse 36. And Jesus showed incredible tolerance to the worst group of all, the Gentiles, those among the Syrophoenicians and Canaanites at Mark 7 verse 24, and those in the Decapolis just days ago at Mark 7 verse 31, where he healed and fed the 4,000. But the apostles would also reckon that by Jesus wandering around Gentile territory, missing synagogue attendance plus 2 essential feasts at the temple, he was already separated from Judaism and the Jewish populace. And this had been going on for months now, actually. And come to think of it, he had done this deliberately ever since crowds of Jews rejected him in the Capernaum synagogue, when he even questioned the apostles' own allegiance. And what was that about? Could it be, the apostles are thinking, could it be Jesus has decided on a new fellowship with only his best disciples? So now he wants them to remain separate from other Jews, all the mainline groups at least, and to no longer eat with them, surely, and shun anything to do with them. This will be the sort of reasoning that led the apostles to conclude it is because we took no bread. But whatever their conclusion or the line of reasoning that led to it, it was exactly the opposite of what Jesus meant when he warned them of the leaven of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. In fact, in Christ's judgment, the apostles were not just wildly wrong, they were inexplicably wrong, as if he reasonably expected them to realize what he meant and reckoned that there was no accounting for their failure to comprehend. The apostles' wrong-headedness made Jesus so disappointed and so vexed that it provoked this censure from him, one of his most sustained complaints on record. "O ye of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves that you have no bread and brought none with you? Do you neither perceive yet nor understand? Are your hearts so hardened? Having eyes, do you still not see? And having ears, do you still not hear?" After reminding them of his own ability to multiply whatever food was necessary, as he had proved in Galilee feeding the 5,000, and then as he proved in Decapolis by feeding the 4,000, he asked his apostles again at Matthew 16 verse 11, "How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you about bread, but that you beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees?" Well, it was only then, after Jesus had chided them so forcefully that, as verse 12 says, they suddenly understood he had not said to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Yet the very fact that they did immediately understand without any further explanation from Jesus indicates that the apostles already had all the knowledge they needed from Jesus' past words and deeds, and they could have correctly deduced what he was telling them this time. I'm glad they didn't understand, because it's good that we have it on record, Jesus' explanation. There's plenty of things recorded in the Gospels that are difficult enough to understand sometimes. Well, how did the apostles know that leaven meant teaching in this case? The answer is at Matthew 13 verse 33, one of Jesus' kingdom parables. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and she hid it in 3 pecks of meal flour and bound it all in until it was all leavened." Our first record of this is from the time when Jesus spoke many things to the multitude in parables. At that same time, as Mark 4 verse 34 says, Jesus explained everything to his disciples privately. So apparently he had explained that in this parable, leaven means doctrine or teaching. And that explanation was given many months prior to ordering them to beware of the leaven of Pharisees and Sadducees at chapter 8. And hence Jesus expected that they should have understood what he meant. In his parable of the baker woman, meal flour is to be understood as the milled grain, which is the word of God sown by Jesus himself in his first parable of the sower. Other older teaching, represented by yesterday's old sourdough, which is used for leavening, was mixed and kneaded into the fresh meal flour until the two were blended together. The original leavened dough was by then indistinguishable from the fresh dough and would surreptitiously have its effect on the entire mass of meal flour, and that's why the bread would then rise when it was cooked. After Jesus had told this and several other parables, he asked his disciples at Matthew 13 verse 51, "Have you understood all these things?" And they said to him, "Yes." Maybe they had not, in fact, but that was their reply. The parable of the baker woman was repeated about a year later at Luke 13 verse 21, where it appears to have been prompted by the hypocrisy, the legalism, and the heartlessness of an officious synagogue leader who tried to forbid or limit Jesus' care and compassion for God's people. But shortly before that occasion, Jesus had had lunch with some lawyers and Pharisees who were provoked by him. And Jesus in turn was provoked by the disagreements he had with them and by the interrogation he was given afterward by several scribes and Pharisees. This is at Luke 11 verses 37 through 54. The original complaint of the lawyers and Pharisees with whom Jesus went to eat was, once again, that Jesus had reclined at table, he was ready to eat, without having first washed his hands. These contentions prompted Jesus at Luke chapter 12 verse 1 to repeat his warning to the disciples, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees," which is hypocrisy. Which is to say, their teaching, their doctrine, it's a sham, it's an act, it's hypocrisy. Here again was Jesus' admonition of months ago to the crowds and the leaders, as well as his disciples, that what truly defiles a man and what he has to be beware of, therefore, is not what goes into a man, such as leavened bread or even the dirt from his hands, but what comes out of a man, from out of the heart of man, including wrong teachings, the teachings of the Jewish leadership who were opposed to Christ. Years after Jesus had first given his parable of the baker woman, the Apostle Paul drew from it to describe the church in Corinth as a lump of leavened dough at 1 Corinthians 5 verses 6 through 8. This was rather ominous for the Corinthian Christians, and as Paul also warned the Galatian Christians at Galatians 5 verse 9, even just a little bit of leaven can leaven the whole lump. For the Galatians, the leavening influence, which as Jesus has implied was an evil influence, the leveling influence for the Galatians, what threatened them was Judaism, just as it had been threatening the apostles when Jesus gave his stern warning. In Corinth, it was the old leaven of fleshly pride that remained in them from their former life in the world, plus the leaven of malice and wickedness in particular. The whole church in Corinth had to purge itself of these to become an unleavened loaf of truth and sincerity, and only then could it celebrate Christ appropriately. As for the Galatian Christians, it was essential they not put their trust in the flesh, as the Judaizers had called them to do by rigid adherence to their laws and customs. Instead, as Paul says at Galatians 5 verses 13 through 14, and with which we will close this morning, Paul writes, "Serve one another through love, for the whole law is fulfilled in the statement, you shall love your neighbour as yourself."